Hello, me Simon, you keyboard person, and today we're going to talk about switch batch variance. Very scary topic, but this all ties into the main question of this video, which is X switch good? And to which the answer is, if you're lucky. So let's start with the basics. We'll start with manufacturing. How are switches made? Well, switches are made out of plastic, and they are made using molds, metallic molds. Now, these metallic molds will go ahead and clamp down on hot plastic, and therefore making the shape of the switch bottom, the switch top, as well as the stem. Now, starting from when the mold is initially used for the first time, its life cycle begins. And with time, the molds will get progressively more and more worn out. As a result, the switches, or the result of the molds, will get incrementally less consistent until the molds are replaced. Now, the molds can be replaced silently or publicly. Now, silently is fairly normal since all molds have a life cycle that depends on the mold itself. Now, there are molds for injection molding that are rated at 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, maybe more uses. And it's up to the manufacturer to decide what is their rate of replacing said molds. So if a manufacturer replaces its molds while still fairly early in the life cycle, we will get more consistent switches, although they have to pay for new molds a lot more often. Realistically, no company would do this because companies exist for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is obviously to make money. So there are silent mold changes, and then there are public mold changes. Now, one of the types of public mold changes can be retooling. So retooling is something like Retool Cherry, which was very public. They actually changed the molds itself instead of just refreshed the molds. Same thing with Greetex. The opposite end of the spectrum is a silent retooling. Silent retooling would be like GMK stabs or Cherry screw-in stabs, and the issue that they had earlier this year with some tolerances when they silently had made some changes, and that basically had ruined the stabilizers for everybody. The general idea is when a mold is new, a mold is good. And switches that are produced with newer molds feel great and much more consistent. And as the molds get older and older, then they feel more and more inconsistent. This is not something that you as a consumer can realistically control or know about, which can be a bit of a pain, especially when it comes to figuring out which switches you like. Example, I have 3 or 4 batches of Gateron yellows that I've bought over the years. They sound completely different. They feel completely different. Some of the batches were actually quite smooth. Some of the batches were quite terrible. And they're all the same basic mold, the same design, although the molds have been obviously changed because they went from good to bad to good again. So somewhere in between, I must have landed a bad batch where it was using older molds or poor quality control. Now, the same thing has happened publicly to a lot of people when it comes to, for example, tangerines, which were one of the first Gateron recolors released about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. Now, the first batch, round 1 of tangerines, were amazing and everybody loved them. And then there was a second round and a third round. And people that bought the first round actually noticed that on the following rounds, they weren't as smooth. They weren't as good. They weren't as consistent. And this was obviously because the first batch of tangerines were using fresh molds. As a result, most Gateron recolors that were released progressively after the tangerines, and there's been a ton starting with the tangerines, were incredibly smooth and lovely, but now they're not so great. Similar situation to Greetex Blacks. Greetex Blacks had a public retooling. So they publicly told everybody, okay, we got brand new molds. Good. At which point I picked up about 400 to 600 switches because I know how this all works. Your best chance of getting a good switch is obviously buying in as the molds are new. And then I noticed in the next batch, I bought another 100, maybe a month or 2 later, and it was like night and day, completely different. Now, disclaimer, some batches will end up completely fine with a lower inconsistency and a lower failure rate when cherry picking compared to other batches, because you're buying from a retailer, not a manufacturer. And a retailer could have, a bag from 6 months ago and a bag from 1 week ago, but in terms of the retailer, they're the same thing. So they'll send whatever they grab. So you might get lucky, you might not get lucky. Now, in general, let's talk about how to buy switches. And the ultimate answer to X is X switch good? So the way that I buy switches is, in general, if I know something is coming out with fresh molds, so a switch design that has never been done before, I will consider it if the price is right. Obviously, the value proposition is very important for me. And in general, if a switch is brand new molds, and they're 80 cents each, that's a little too high for me. So for example, I did not buy into the first round of Gateron inks. And the first round of Gateron inks were actually amazing. But I did buy into the second round. And that was the round with the switch bottom inconsistencies and the leaves that fell out and all of that. And that just goes to show you, just because somebody went and bought a really good switch and you're like, oh, that's actually interesting. If you go ahead and buy it then, or a week later, or a month later, you could end up with a completely different feeling and sounding switch. But again, it's all about your luck. It's all about your luck. And when you're gambling, you want to invest as little as possible, unless you have a gambling problem. But for example, what I would do is I would target switches that have a long history of being above average, and also a long history of being affordable. So I would take a 15 to 25 cent standard Gateron switch over a brand new hype switch, which is 70 cents to $1, because I know that for 70 cents to $1, I could still end up with a bad batch. And hopefully this should kind of answer the question of, is X switch good? To which the answer is sometimes, and sometimes not really. Obviously, there are some switches that are just inherently bad, but this is meant to educate people about more hyped switches, well-received switches. So switches that come out and everybody's like, oh, this is great. Just because they say it's great, just because their switches are great, it does not mean that your switches will be great. And you have to take that into consideration before you go and shell out maybe $120 for, a keyboard's worth of switches. So keep that in mind. If you guys in the comments have had a experience with switch batch variance, a negative experience, let me know in the comments. And if you're watching this video, look down to the comments and you'll see that, I'm not a crazy man on the internet. This is a very, very normal thing. Also, if you've gotten incredibly lucky and all your switches have been perfect, tell me in the comments. I'll come and live with you. You must be super lucky. Anyway, if you liked the video, drop a like, drop a sub to the channel, and I'll see you guys on the next one.